Hello and welcome to another episode of Soul Nectar Show, that show where we talk about all things essence, where we gather around the campfire and we share our stories of connection to that which is bigger than us, to the big mystery, those synchronistic moments that we experience that they lead us to another understanding of life. They lead us to some new conclusion or piece of clarity or another journey that seems really unusual that we didn't expect. And then it's like, oh, I kind of like this. This is pretty cool. And on this show, I love to talk about people's journeys to awakening, how they get in sync with that larger consciousness that we are part of and also we're immersed in, how we navigate that, how we interact with it, how we, what are we supposed to do with all this? So I love those discussions. And I'm your host, Carrie Hummingbird. And this is the kind of thing I love to talk to people about. So if you're interested in deepening your journey or going on a longer journey, you can check out my website and schedule a time to chat with me about your particular circumstance and where you are right now. That is available at my website, carriehummingbird.com, Kerri, hummingbird.com. And today's guest is going to be going to have a very good discussion about spiritual awakening, because he is an author, educator, counselor, and mentor for spiritual awakening. And so I welcome Andrew Seaton to the show. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Kerri. Thanks for the invitation to chat with you on your show.
Absolutely. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about Andrew before we get started. So for more than 4 decades, he delved deeply into educational philosophy and psychology, old wisdom and new science, reports of higher consciousness, and a wide range of personal development, holistic wellness, and spiritual awareness practices. And as Andrew experienced all the ups and downs of his life, his working life was quite varied, but mostly in education. He had lots of different roles, and he wrote a beautiful award-winning PhD thesis titled Investing in Intelligence, an Inquiry into Educational Paradigm Change. So the journey that we're going to be talking about today is a little more aligned with what he experienced in 2017 and 18, where he was very focused on living the insights and practices that he describes in his book, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple: How to See Through the Mist of the Mind to the Peace of the Here and Now. And so we're going to have some interesting conversation around this. I encourage you to look him up on his website, awakeningmadesimple.org. And of course, all of this will be in the show notes as part of the episode. So Andrew, welcome to the show. And I'd love to invite you to tell us wherever you want to begin the journey, because you know it's a journey. So I don't know where you want to start about your spiritual awakening, but wherever you want to begin, let's make it so.
That's often, like the first kind of question I get asked, and it's kind of so open. I always find it a bit overwhelming because there's a million places I could start. Let me start with the word that you used, essence. The essence of life, the essence of who I am, the essence of who you are. This is a question that's been in my mind. I'm going to use the inverted commas around mind since my late teens. I've always sensed, there's more going on than is commonly talked about. And I left high school and studied teaching and found it most uninspiring, the program. And I knew that they were just scratching the scratch on the surface. Come on, tell me about what a human being really is and what a human being really can be, because I know there's more going on here. Don't give me this surface rubbish. And I struggled, for decades in and out of the profession of teaching, and then eventually doing consultancy work and teaching teachers and so forth. I became, of course, very keen to dig into, education of the whole person. What would it look like? What can we do about it? But yeah, from my college days, I kind of had these two pathways, two journeys. I should say something in a minute about that word journey too, as I do in the book. My personal life and my working life / professional life, because in both kind of fields, I was trying to dig deep into what makes sense, in this thing we call life and experience as life, and why do I experience my life like I am experiencing it rather than as something different that I sense could also be possible, or that like that person across the road is experiencing their life, and I had had a lot of stuff to work through in my kind of karmic contract, if we could use that term. I had lots of ups and downs in my life, again, in my working life and in my personal life. A lot of challenges, a lot of highs, quite a lot of lows, and all the time I was digging, what's really going on? What's beneath the surface here, and how could I possibly access it? Because I've heard and read, people, not very common people, as it were, or the rarer kind of people who've talked about an experience of something quite different than what we experience in the everyday. How do I have what they're having? kind of question was in my mind, and really I looked into so many things, so many philosophies, so many practices, so many theories, and I struggled to pull it together to really make sense of it, because there was lovely, inspiring stuff regularly discovered, and yet it was all higgledy-piggledy, a bit here, a bit there, and even those little needles were in a haystack of kind of craziness in the world that we live in, So I really struggled for a long, long time. I'm about to turn 66 in a few days, and all my adult life, I've been trying to figure out, how do I put this all together? And I often wondered, will I ever make it? Will I ever, really figure it out? But I have figured it out. And I feel a very beautiful energy here as I stop just to recognize this, that I have figured it out. And a few years ago, I spent a year where I was really life kind of had me in a fairly inward looking and removed from the world kind of phase. And I really was quite focused every day on the insights and simple practices that I describe in the book that you mentioned, Kerry, that's just come out, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple. And I found that I found a way of pulling together what I'd come across in a way that really began to make sense. And even more important, not just to make sense, in my understanding that it really sat well, and it really rang a bell of harmony and recognition in me. It began to give me real traction in my aspiration to feel differently about my life as I live it. One of the key, we come back to this word essence. What's the essence of life, and what is the essence of who we are? And the key misconception that we grow up in the modern world, in any culture that you want to name on our planet pretty much, is that there's this assumption that we are our mind. And if we can cultivate our mind, then we'll be more likely to live a happy and successful life. That's the mistake, because we're not our mind. Mind is a wonderful tool that we have, but we're not our mind. We're an essence of life that's deeper than mind. And the mind hates that because the mind can't figure out what the hell you're talking about. If you give me a concept and I'll be able to grapple with it, but don't tell me that I'm an essence that's beyond the mind, because I can't deal with it. And that's the answer to life, is to recognize that the mind isn't the be all and end all. And in the book, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, I give some first of all, a simple structure of understanding for the reader as to how it is that we come to be identified with the mind. But really how it can be seen and experienced very quickly and easily that the essence of who we are is not the mind. It's something more subtle than the mind. It's more formless than the mind, and certainly more formless and subtle than the physical body that we are. Great as it is to have a physical body too, but that's not who we are. And if your listeners, a very simple way to recognize these things, and many of your listeners of your program, of course, will be quite already, in tune with this kind of way of thinking about things. But, if they think back to when they were a kid, under 10 years old, did they feel like they were them? Well, yeah, of course I felt like I was me. I remember when I was 8, when I was 9, when I was 10, I felt like me. And in your mid-teens, did you feel like you were you? Yeah, I did. When you were 20, when you were 30, when you were 40, on you might go. Did you feel like you were you? Of course I did. I've always felt like I'm me. But then if we look, okay, has your body ever changed? Well, of course, yeah, in big ways it's changed, and what about the things you believe about yourself and the world? Have any of those things changed? Yeah, some of them have changed in a big way, and lots of them have changed in little ways. And what about the roles you've had in life? Have any of them changed? You were a student for a while, grade school student, high school, maybe you went to college, maybe you didn't, you got a job. 3 years later, you changed to a different job. 5 years later, you changed your career entirely. So were you ever any of those things that you did, the roles you had in life? I can't be any of those things because they've all changed. And yet I've been sort of unchanging, as it were. I've always been me. And so this is who we are. This is the essence of who we are, that's usually dimly felt, sensed in the background of our life experience. It is formless awareness that's been the witness of all of what we've perceived and all the emotions we've felt, all the thoughts that have popped up. We think we choose our thoughts, by the way. We don't choose our thoughts. They just pop up. And we are so identified with them, though, since babyhood, and in our culture, and goes through schooling, and we become so identified with the thoughts that pop up in our mind that we think they're who we are, and and of course that they're true. But thoughts, the conceptual ideas that come through our mind, can never be shown to be true, and we can easily come to see that they're false. We can easily come to see that I'm the silent observer that's noticing. Another thing your listeners can do, even right in this moment, takes a few moments of silence just to, and I know that, in media kind of situations, we don't like silence too much, but if your listeners just ask themselves this question right now, I wonder what the next thought to pop up in my mind will be. And so most people have a kind of a real kind of wow kind of experience when they ask themselves that question and just pause for a while, because first of all, they notice initially as they're looking, there's nothing happening. They're just looking, they're just waiting. And that stillness is who they are. And then they notice, oh, a thought pops up, and it's quite often a completely kind of random kind of thing. I remember when I was a child and I kept some guinea pigs, or a hamster, you might say, in the United States, or any kind of thought might pop up, and you think, well, I didn't choose that. It just, there it was, And this is a beautiful, ultra simple thing that people can do just to begin to notice, wow, I'm not my thoughts. They kind of roll relentlessly through my waking hours and minutes and seconds. And because they're so relentless and ever present, we think that that's who we are. That's my life. This is the experience of being me, is all these thoughts that are rolling, rolling, rolling. And yet they're not at all. And the last thing I'll say in this rather breathless introduction, before I give you a chance, Kerry, to make a comment or ask me a question, is that here's this beautiful discovery that people can make. That the things that trouble us in life, or it just internally, the things that trigger our negative emotions and our frustrations and disappointments in life, and sometimes our more intensive kind of agonies, or our just more general, everyday, subtle lack of fulfillment in life, is not what we're experiencing. We grow up with this very deep and fundamental assumption that what I'm feeling is a result of what I'm experiencing. Surprise, it's not at all the result of what we're experiencing. What we experience, especially in terms of our emotional life and especially in terms of our troubled emotions, is the result of a thought that pops into our mind about what we're experiencing. If the thought is believed. Now, a thought might pop up into my mind about what I'm experiencing, and if I don't particularly believe it or think of it has any significance, it doesn't faze me, it doesn't trouble me, and no emotions are triggered. But if I have an experience and then have a thought that what I've just experienced is bad, that person shouldn't have said that, it's bad that they said that to me, or I'm bad because of what I said to somebody, or what I did yesterday, I cut that car off in the traffic and I feel so bad about doing that, you know. So what's troubling me is believing a thought that my experience was bad, or that I'm bad because of what I did, or that person's bad, or life is bad because of what it's brought me or hasn't brought me. What's troubling me is believing a thought that it's bad. But you can never prove a thought that something is bad. If you begin, and I show in the book very simple ways how people can question the thoughts that they assume are true, that they assume are who they are, and that are, you know, kind of, as it were, orchestrating all their emotional experience of life. They can quickly and easily come to see that there's no way they can know that it's true. They can usually very quickly and easily see some possible ways in which they could see that the thought is false, that the opposite could also be true or turn out to be true. And they can also see that actually after a while they notice, well, regardless, I'm the awareness that's noticing this thought that's popped up. I'm not even the thought. And so in this way, people can very simply begin to experience the peace-filled stillness that is their true nature, their true self. And that leads to quite a different way if people take this, as it were, seriously and do it on a regular basis, to begin to find that more and more of the time, they're just this beautiful, peace-filled presence of the intelligence that is life, here in this moment, being an expression of life, participating, interacting with people, doing the things I do, but not identified with the thoughts and the forms of this world, and able to express the universality through our individuality. Full stop. Or you would say, period.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, that's a lot to get started with, but let's.
You asked the question.
I sure did. Yeah, this is probably how people feel when they interview me on the show. I'm like down in the depths, you know, right away.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
I've never been a superficial kind of guy.
Yeah, me neither. So this is what's fascinating is these thoughts that run around in people's minds. So interesting. Because of course, I always thought that was me too. And I would go to psychotherapy sessions and sit there and just talk the same story over and over and over and over and over again, right? Just like week after week. And then the next thing would happen.
Yes.
And I had this really interesting experience one time in a plant medicine ceremony, my first plant medicine ceremony with ayahuasca, where at the end of the ceremony, I had taken 2 doses, which everybody else was, so that meant that everybody else was done and I was still going, you know? And it was intense. It was an intense journey. And at the end, I'm lying down trying to sleep, and I suddenly become aware that the voice is really loud. And now I know it's not me. And it's chattering away and it won't shut up. And I just said, can we make that stop? Let's just stop that now. And it just went bam and turned off.
Right. Yeah.
And that was astounding to me, that awareness that this was some kind of stream of thoughts or voice or something, like a player going on.
Yes.
But it wasn't me. And since that happened, I don't have the same experience of thoughts in my head. Now it's more like even as I'm speaking now, it's not happening up here, it's happening somewhere else in my heart or something. Like it's just happening someplace else. And then I'm speaking, but it's not coming from some words here, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain this kind of stuff, but it feels like it's coming from like a more, the more ephemeral aspect of me, or the quiet one, you know, that's just sort of there and is speaking through me now, instead of this thing happening with the constant thoughts.
Yeah, well, um, it's funny that when we begin to have this sense that I'm the quiet observer of my experience, there can be a temptation for the mind then to come in and to really analyze that. and this is a bit of a temptation that's worth being wary of, because it can throw us back into identifying with our thoughts and operating out of our thoughts. So it's interesting to hear your description of this experience that you had, that, as it were, began to really unhook you from identifying with your thoughts.
I don't know where some of those things come from. I don't know if somebody else is thinking it and I just picked up on it, or like, where, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, I think we can try to figure that out. We can try too hard to figure that out, and it takes it down the avenue into the realm of mind, which the mind loves, because it begins to have us re-identify with the mind as where what happens that's important needs to happen there in the mind. But ultimately it doesn't, you know. In terms of where the thoughts come from, well, you know, there are people who say they're in the ether, you know, and they're in the cultural consciousness, or the collective consciousness. It's just that we're like a big antenna that sort of taps into thoughts that are out. Really, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. And even more important, I think it's a distraction, as it were. I mean, okay, if you're an esoteric scientist and that's your thing, well, go for it, you know. But I'd say for most people, don't bother about it, figuring that stuff out, because it only takes you back into thinking. Rather, just enjoy living your life, realizing and experiencing, in inverted commas. Even, you know, we get trapped in our habitual way of interpreting the world through concepts, through the mind. So even if I say experience your life differently, there's the implication that there's me then, and there's this stillness that I experience, or this essence that I experience. But no, there's not. There's just, that's what you are. So the word awakening is actually, I find, a bit more an effective one than experiencing life, you know, the stillness of life, or the stillness of your essence, you know, whereas you might not have experienced it before. I don't like the word experience so much as awaken to this beingness of who we are, as the contentedness, peace-filled, kind of often playful, often loving kind of energy, inverted commas, that is the essence of who I am, and the essence of who every other person is, and the essence of the life that we're living. So culturally, there can be this temptation to go in and analyze it and categorize it and chop and dice it, but it's only just another distraction. It's not necessary to really to enjoy living this new way, this new awakened way, to give too much to the mind. In fact, it only is an enticement of the mind to come back to giving the mind some prominent place in our life.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was having a discussion with my husband last night, and it came to me, how does anybody know what good is? Like, good to me, inside of me, with all of my conditioning, life experience, whatever, means something. But then inside my husband, it means something totally different. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's a thing called good and we just all know what good means. But there's that question that got raised. You know, we were talking about perspective in your book. And what is good? I mean, do we even know, like, these languages, this language that we use, we try to communicate with each other this experience or this something that's happening. We want to share it or experience it together. But even communicating it is so challenging because the words, the language itself might mean something completely different inside of each one of us. So that becomes an extra, thing to be aware of. I had this sudden realization in the store when it just dawned on me. I just saw him and I thought, wow, he's in a totally different body and he's perceiving things completely different than me. And I don't even know how it feels like to be him because I'm not him, I'm me. So it was a fascinating moment of connection that I shared with him. And then we had that provocative discussion about, well, how do you even know? It's one
Yeah.
of these things.
Well, the question of good and bad is a huge one, and I address it in the book Spiritual Awakening Made Simple. It's a huge, if you like, it's almost the archetypal undercurrent of our pattern of interpreting our experience in this life, this question of good and bad. It's an issue for the conceptual mind, because it is in the nature of the conceptual mind to deal with conceptual opposites. Good and bad, if you were to say to somebody good and bad don't exist, and in a certain way in my book, in what I talk to people, I say that is the case, that there is no good and bad. Well, some people, smile and more or less take it on board. Other people go into fits of different kinds, of objection, because it's so fundamental, such a fundamental assumption in our culture. It's a fundamental assumption in our culture because it's a fundamental pattern of operation of the conceptual mind. But if we realize that reality doesn't exist in the conceptual mind, then the question of good and bad starts to take on more of the relative perspective that would be more appropriate and more helpful to us to operate on, using those terms, rather than thinking that they're reality or truth. William Shakespeare summed it up quite nicely in his play Hamlet, when he said, nothing is good or bad. Nothing is either, something like this, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that if you really start exploring it, pretty much anything that you think is bad, you can generally find some way in which it could also alternatively be seen to be good. Any person in their everyday life can think of this. And if you think that you're a good person, you can generally think of something that you've done or said in the past that you felt was bad. And if you feel you're a bad person, you can generally think of something that you've said or done in the past that you thought was good. So neither is true. Neither is anything whatever to do with who you actually are, these thoughts of good and bad. If I think that Kerry Hummingbird is a good person, well, it's my mind talking. And if I sniffed around a little bit, I could probably find something that I didn't like about.
Well, just read my first book. You'll find something you don't like.
I could probably find something about you that my mind might say, well, that's bad. And you talked about conditioning, and now let's have a look at conditioning, because it's so huge. The funny thing, I came across, exploring conditioning a fair bit when I was doing my deeper research into education. I mean, obviously I broadly was familiar with the term, but I really started to look into it deeply in my investigations into education and what's really the nature of learning and this knowledge that we value so highly, and what is the nature of human intelligence. And I began to realize, and it was quite uncomfortable for a while to begin to realize how much of my functioning and how much of everybody's functioning is actually conditioned functioning. Almost all of what we do and say and the way we live our lives is a result of our conditioning. And I give lots of examples, and one or two, quite humorous examples in my book about how the things that we think are good and nice or desirable or appealing are largely cultural. They're either broadly cultural or they're individually cultural, in the sense that it's just purely a result of the experiences that I've had in the past. One person loves dogs, another person got bit in the bum when they were 6 years old by a dog, and so they hate dogs. So almost all of our patterns of thinking, and our patterns of emotion, and our patterns of behavior, and our patterns of experience are the result of programming that we've experienced since we were born. And even prenatally, we are responsive to what's going on in our environment. We're starting to form patterns, and some would say, and I don't know this as a personally observed fact, that prior to the incarnation, in the fetus, there we were souls, and we had patterns of patterns of operation, or patterns of character, or whatever you want to call it, that needed to be then experienced in the material world and played out again. So these patterns, whether you believe in a pre-life or an afterlife or not, it doesn't matter. These patterns are basically what people refer to as karma. It's our conditioning that gets played out. And the beautiful thing about that is that when you recognize that that good and bad only exist in the mind, also then the notions of good and bad karma only exist in the mind. They're irrelevant and a complete distraction to think about whether you're experiencing good or bad karma. Just understand that the way you're experiencing life is a reflection of the patterns of functioning, mental, emotional, behavioral, that you have mistakenly identified with. When you begin to question those patterns, the karma dissolves, as it were. Your experience of life ceases to need to be reflected back to you to show you these patterns. And so what shape then does your life take if it's no longer driven by karma? Well, it takes the shape that the essence of life wants it to take shape, in the expression that we are as an individual expression of the universal consciousness. We become the expression of life. We become an expression of the creativity and intuition that is the universal intelligence expressing through us as an individual. That expression no longer blocked or distorted or interfered with by the mistaken identification that we've had with form, with conceptual form, physical form, emotional form. In other words, it's no longer blocked or interfered with or distorted by our karma.
Well, what's really interesting to me is the experience I have recently been unfolding into, which is being that bigger self, whatever you want to call that, through me, as me.
Yeah.
So not letting, and it's like it just sort of happens. I don't really, and some people call that flow state, that they're like in a flow state of being, or they just being. And then things are still happening. It's not like you're just oming, indefinitely on a mountaintop.
Yeah.
It's like, but the state of that, what I imagine that might be like, because I've had some long meditations, it's almost like that dreamy state comes in and this just sort of flows, like right now, so it just happens as you're breathing. Because you don't have to think about it. You don't have to try to be it. You just are it, and it is you. So you're not really trying to be anything or do anything. You're just going along with whatever's arising.
Yeah, well, I like the way that you expressed that, particularly at the end there. You're not trying to be anything in particular. And many people who aspire to, the realization or the expression or the awakening to the spiritual dimension of themselves and life, many of them get really caught up in mental conceptions of what being spiritual should look like. And again, it's just another trap laid by the conceptual mind, by the conceptual identity. I'm a spiritual person, and that looks like this. I do these sorts of things. I say these sorts of things. I do these sorts of practices. I eat certain things, and I don't eat certain other things. And there are myriad rules that the mind applies if we allow our aspiration to live a spiritual life to be a conceptualized thing. And I have to say that 90 or 95% of people who are very actively identifying as being, wanting to live and trying to live a spiritual life are caught up in what the mind is telling them a spiritual life should be, which is not even to go into the territory of what people, religious people say, a different kind of, inverted commas, different kind of spirituality, religious spirituality, but they're so caught up in what the mind is telling them that means. And the irony is that what it means is absolutely nothing whatever to do with what the mind can conceive. The more strongly we believe in anything, the more removed we are from being that flow expression that you used. You use that term, and I've heard it used. A guy with an unpronounceable name wrote a beautiful book about flow. Chich and Charlie, you know the one, maybe.
Yeah.
But spirituality can't be defined. It's not about following rules. I'm glad this came up. I want to get it out because, and I say it in my book in different ways, but spirituality is not about following conceptual rules, not following rules about, it's not even following rules about good and bad that come from the mind. Let's come back to this question of good and bad. I'm glad we came back here because I didn't fully deal with it. Well, fully, inverted commas, I'll never fully deal with it. But look, being spiritual is absolutely nothing whatever to do with being good and bad. Good and bad are games played by the conceptual mind, by the conditioned mind. That's where I took myself off the track of coming back to answer your question. Ultimately, I went off to talking about conditioning. Forgot to say that one of the core elements of conditioning is around what things are good and what things are bad. And whether I'm good if I do certain things and say certain things, or whether I'm bad if I say those things, all those sorts of things. Now, they're judgments of the conditioned mind. They're nothing whatever to do with truth or reality. And yet, everyone still has some sort of sense, that there's something, it would be good to wake up, for example. So I'm still applying this word good, it would be good for me to realize my spiritual nature and allow it to flow freely in the world. That would be good. So there's this sense of, well, there's good and bad. It's bad to be, as it were, shut down and locked into a karmic prison, and it would be good to be free of that. So how does that work then if good and bad are only, well, there's, as it were, two levels. If we're playing the game of good and bad, as is almost universally in this world played, it's out of the conceptual mind. And things can be endlessly debated. And that's why politics and various other fields of human endeavor are endless debates. They're
I don't tune into that.
They're unresolvable debates because nothing in the conceptual world can ever be resolved. No conceptual idea. I mentioned in my book that the history of philosophy, East and West, modern and ancient, is replete with this recognition that no conceptual idea can ever be proven to be true for certain. But they can all be refuted. That's the game of the conceptual mind and of the conditioned mind. But there is a sense of things being more real, of being more true, that we begin to feel more clearly as we clear away the mist of the conditioned mind, as we begin to question the dominance of the thoughts that pop up in our mind that we have tended to allow to run our lives. We see more and more that they're A, can't ever be shown to be true, and B, they're not me anyway. They're just thoughts that arise and so forth, largely out of my conditioning or the cultural conditioning or both. As we become less and less identified with the mind and more feeling this background sense of calm and presence, what we find is that we still then have a sense that this is the way it feels right for me to go in. We could say it would be right for me to go do this, but I don't feel it's right for me to, or even if you wanted to say it would be wrong for me or it would be bad for me to do that. No, I feel it would be good for me to do this. It's a different, as it were, level of consciousness that's saying this feels right, this feels not right for me. This feels good, this feels bad. It's not the conceptual mind's game going on here. It's what feels more real for me.
Well, you're
This
saying
feels right.
feel instead of think.
Yes, yes, it is that. And the other aspect of this different kind of sense of good and bad is that in the conceptual mind, good and bad are very much wrapped around attachment, around, you know, buying into needing things to happen a certain way, feeling bad if they don't happen that way, feeling great if they do happen that way, elated for a certain short period of time, you know, at some wonderful success, this good thing that I wanted to achieve, I did it way, and aren't I great for doing that? Or I feel so good about myself for doing that. All these conceptual, this is all conceptual mind play stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The ego, or the conceptual sense of self, says this is all great, or I would hate it if that happened, or I hate it when that person speaks to me that way, and blah blah. This is all very much attachment stuff that drives, of course, our emotional reactions and often our behaviors, and the kind of circus of reactivity that characterizes still the world of humanity most of the time. But this other level of good and bad. And I still hesitate even to say the words, because the mind for many people will grab hold of them and say, yeah, continue the debate. No, they're beyond debate, because they're a different level of beingness and different level of expression of the essence of who I am and of what's going on in the world, a recognition that the world ultimately, even with all the human circus that's going on, it's still ultimately orchestrated by an infinite intelligence compared with the puny little intelligences that we think we each have as individuals, you know, or as a culture. So good and bad comes to be an expression of something that the mind doesn't even play a part in hardly, except in its most mechanical ways. You know, yes, I'll work out how to do this particular practical thing. Yes, that's fine. Mind still has a practical role to play as a tool, but the good and bad really are quite different things that aren't driven by attachment. They're driven by the intelligence of life wanting to express in a particular way through this particular individuality.
Yeah, that really goes along with teachings I received for my book last year, The Second Wave, where the invitation was to realize that the unique thumbprint that we each have is there for a reason. It's symbolic of that we are all unique. And
Yes.
it's that unique creation, you already are that. So you don't have to try to be unique. You don't have to try. You just are. You are unique, and then the energy, the consciousness flows through you, expresses as you, as this unique thing that was created, this unique being, perspective, whatever word you want to use, and then you're just experiencing it.
Yeah, that's nice. And interesting that you said, you know, you don't even have to try to be unique. You can be this universality with that uniqueness, which is there already. You know, don't need to create it. And it's like the
Programmed in.
universality, the essence of who we are also is something, and this is another illusion that's out there pretty widely, you know, promulgated, that we need to cultivate the spiritual aspect of who we are. We don't at all. We are that spiritual aspect, and it's fully there right now. It's not, we don't need to get into a long journey, come back to that where we touched on earlier on, of trying to find or cultivate this spirituality or fix something that's wrong with us. No, the essence of who we are is already this formless, eternal awakeness or presence, and it's found to be there the minute you question the things that are disguising it, or, you know, kind of masking it or veiling it. When you begin to question the thoughts that you've been identifying with, wow, what's there? Wow, this peaceful universality, which is the essence of who I am, is already there. I want to just quickly touch on one other thing that came to my mind, Kerry, when you were talking about you don't need to cultivate the individuality. And there's another, in chapter 7 of my book, I talk about half a dozen traps that people very commonly get caught up in on the road of self-discovery. And one of them is, the spiritual me trap, and we touched on it a few minutes ago, even just here. We get ideas in the mind about what it means to be a spiritual person, and we let those mind rules, guide everything that we do and say, or a lot of what we do and say, thinking that going this way and not that way makes me a more spiritual person. It's got absolutely nothing to do with it. But one of the traps that I got caught up in, and I just want to mention it in case any of your listeners have this as either as a seed thought or as something that's playing out right now. As my spiritual awakening unfolded more and more, I began for a while to play out an idea, a conceptualized idea, that this meant because I'm really this universal consciousness, that I should, as it were, squash or sabotage the individuality, the unique individuality. And after a while, I realized what was going on. I realized that no, being awake doesn't mean wiping away your individuality, wiping out your individuality. It's why, as you said, Kerry, it's really why we're here, to be this unique. And again, the mind can't handle it because there's this paradox. It's a unique individual expression of the universal. Now, conceptually, that's an oxymoron. That you can't have one without either you're individual or you're the universal. No, beyond the mind, that's what we are, an individual expression of the universal. So don't try, I would say to anybody, don't try and wipe the slate clean of who you are as an individual expression. No, just continue to question what's false, and what'll awaken is the beautiful expression of what, in a certain way, much of what you've always felt is you is indeed you. Some of what you've thought, most of what you've thought is you, is not you. So question that part, but that doesn't mean wiping away your individuality or your personality. Continue to allow the expression of you as it feels beautiful to express it.
Oh gosh, well that's beautiful. Wow, what a beautiful, deep conversation. And I think that leaves people in a good space. Be the individual expression of you, and trust that that's the oneness expressing itself through your individuality, your unique expression. So you get to be both. And, just allow it to be. I think the only last thing I want to say is, it just seems like there's like a progression of awareness. That's all. It's like you just at first maybe not aware that you're more than the body. You're just not aware of it. You just for whatever reason. And then you start to become aware of it and that's when the spiritual judge and the spiritual persona begins, right? Because you become aware of this thing that's bigger than you, and you're like, oh, then you want to be in controlling that somehow, right? So it's like the next thing to control, the next thing to own, the next thing to whatever, right? And that's the awkward phase of the spiritual awakening process, is that like ego aspect of you tries to own the unownable. Like it's just you can't, it's just, but you try to and predict it, and try to, if I do this and I pray every day and I do this and just this way, then I'll be spiritual, so try to like make rules around it and a procedure. But it's not like that. So on the other side of that awkwardness is like this relaxing, usually through some bumps and stuff, where you get jolted out of that way of thinking, because you can't really think about it. So then you just start to be it. And that to me explains why sometimes there's extremely like earthy people, like farmers or people that just like really earthy, sort of more simple people that get spirituality way quicker than people who are brilliant. is because of this, like, this in between of the mind really wanting to define and grasp and plan and strategize around it and own it, the unownable. You can't own that. You don't own it, you just be it. That's like on the other side. And then the mind is so brilliant through all of this training and, inquiry and all this that happens in that in between. Then the mind can be actually used. It can actually be quite a conduit, because then the language, it picks up on the nuances, and it's like it can be served that way. It can be in service to the oneness that way, is what I want to say.
Yes, yeah, well, that's nicely said, and such a crucial point. I emphasize in the introduction to my book that it's not a book primarily about spiritual concepts, and it's a book about to help the reader to discover for themselves and to perhaps find an inner recognition. A bell goes off or a light bulb goes off, whatever.
Yeah.
They discover for themselves this true nature of who they are, rather than having some more food for the conceptual mind to think about who they are. And one of all these traps, these half a dozen traps that I talk about in chapter 7, are indeed the conceptual mind trying to figure out a way, and so often being successful, Kerry, in this world, in tricking the person who's aspiring to live out their spirituality, tricking them into identifying with certain things as being spiritual, and hence maintaining control over the person, the expression of spirituality. Now, the egoic mind, or the egoic self, the egoic identity, is not a separate entity, but it tends to kind of feel like it is. It tends to function as though it is, and it does not want to die. It does not, better qualify that too. I'm going to say here that it doesn't even need to die. There's always this conceptual sense that I'm this. Yes, that's right. But it does need to be in service to it's like the mind itself. The conceptual sense of self is provisional. It's my thumbprint in this world of expression, but it's not who I am in my essence. And so it wants to be more. It wants to be more than the thumbprint. It wants to keep us under the thumb, and the essence of us under the thumb. And so the mind will play all kinds of tricks to have us overthink all this stuff about spirituality. And as you said, by comparison with the farmer and other people whose work and lives are not dominated by their mind, who often are living far more spiritual lives, yes, in the sense that I talk about it, and that's meaningful to me in terms of being an expression in this world of the essence of life, unencumbered by the interference of conditioned patterns of thinking and behavior. Very often, yeah, they're expressing that more and more beautifully. They're more spiritually awake very often than the people who are highly educated and highly identified with their mind and the body of knowledge that's come to be, their little area of expertise and all this sort of stuff, which is what leads them away from being able to be the free expression of the essence of life that they are, because they're trapped in this self-concept, this self-identity, conceptual identity, that's trying to kind of run the show, and all the time trying to prop it itself up and get more credibility and get more validation, and play this game that's ultimately it's not a fun game. It's a nightmare, so in this awakening process, the mind will try and come in and derail it. And I want to come back again and say, I was going to say, unfortunately, nothing's good or bad, right? For 90% of the world's population, it's succeeding in derailing them into thinking about their spirituality rather than being an expression of their spirituality. And that's ultimately why I have come, I'm going to say, I've come to this life to write this book, to be a contribution to helping to show how this is a mistake, and it's actually quite easy to unhook from it. But we need to unhook from it, because the tricky mind, very, very tricky, slippery customer, is the conceptual mind. It's playing all these kinds of games to keep us off track. But ultimately, even the slippery customer that is the mind, ultimately it is the instrument of the universal intelligence. And this is what's happening in the world right now. We can see an upswelling of this spiritual awakening in various manifestations. And the days of the dominance of form over the formless, of the mind over the spiritual essence of who we are, those days are numbered. And people are waking up and finding ways to have the essence of who they are be the expression of their life, not interfered with by or troubled by the conditioned mind.
Mm. Well said. Well said. Yes. That's where we're going. That's where we're in the process of that. And it's going to happen naturally anyway. It's already happening. And so, you know, just, I think the more we can just be, the better, you know.
Naturally is us.
It's happening already.
Yes.
You know, we're all connected. We're all experiencing very similar things, maybe at different ends of the spectrum, but this is general, the movement is happening. And so we're all part of it. And so it's I'd like to think of it like, you know, if there's a dog that is like our consciousness overall, the oneness, we're some little speck on, on that dog. The dog's gonna go, we're gonna go where it goes. So just enjoy the ride. Pretty much. Just enjoy the ride. You can either be irritated by it or you can be delighted by it, and it's really your choice. You know, just enjoy the ride.
Yeah, that reminds me of a little comment I make in the book about don't get too caught up, I suggest to people, in this aspiration, which always feels so noble, of, you know, needing to make a difference. Just be awake, and you'll play your part. But there's an intelligence vaster than any of us that has this whole thing, that's orchestrating this whole thing, which is us. And our part is to wake up, not to give to the mind, I'm passionate about this and I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to make this statement in the world. I'm really going to go for this and make a difference. Don't be overly attached to making a difference, because you'll be interfering, actually.
Well, you actually will make a difference as you allow the spirit to move through you.
That's right. That's the only difference that needs to be made. That's right. Yes.
But yeah, you try to control it, it like clamps it down. I've noticed that, because I've been through this part of the journey. It's like it clamps you, it squeezes you, and because it doesn't work, because it's like the ego trying to take credit for this huge thing that's happening.
Exactly.
And that's just not true. So anything that's not true doesn't happen. So it doesn't happen.
That's right.
But you are here for great things.
Yes, but not what the mind defines as those.
No, you are here for great things. And we are in the age of Aquarius. We're entering it. It is happening, and you are here for it. And it is happening through you as you allow it. And if you try to control it, it'll squash.
That's right. That's right.
Well, enjoy the ride. I was going to say that one more time, you know, everybody, enjoy the ride. This is what a great book I've read. I've read a good part of this book that Andrew's put together. I think it's got a lot of really wise points to it, really helpful. So, you know, if you're into that kind of thing, you can check out the link in the show notes, and you can click through and go get that on Amazon and check it out. And Andrew's website is also on there, so you'll be able to go check that out. And in the meantime, anything last words you want to say to people, Andrew?
Well, there's one statement in the book which is really a reflection of a deep theme in the book, and I just want to say it because it's a nice thing for any of your listeners to hear. And it's just this one-liner, or a couple of sentences. Everything bad that you have ever believed about yourself is false. It was just the judging play of the conditioned mind, just a figment of imagination.
Mm, beautiful. Ooh, I feel that medicine. That's gorgeous. Thank you. Awesome. Well, we're gonna give kisses to people on the way out, but before we do that, I want to encourage everybody here. Go ahead, like the show, leave us a comment, tell us what you thought about the episode, engage, and share it out with anybody that you think might benefit from this this wisdom and this conversation that we had here today and the energy that we were exchanging. So check it out, and here comes your kisses, and then we'll see you next week. You want to contribute? We're gonna give kisses. Love you, everybody, and we'll see you next time on Soul Nectar Show. Bye for now.